Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to show you my London system repertoire. As you may know, I have played the London system in many tournament games throughout a period of about 2 years, and then I stopped. I'm going to show you the best way to play the London, and I'm also going to show you the setups that made me quit the London system. I've made a separate video on them. You can find it in the description and in the comments below. But today we're going to focus on how to win games with the London system, and I'm going to focus on ideas instead of theory. Okay, so we are going to be looking at 10 different setups for black, not particularly connected to exact move orders, but the ideas behind them. And we are going to look at every sensible setup black can play and learn what to do against it. The London system repertoire is available on Noctie. If you follow the link in the description, you will reach this page. And on Noctie, you can import any opening repertoire and practice it. Instead of watching videos or going through mindless theory and learning lines, instead, you can play games in the opening against a human-like AI and learn that way. Let's say I want to play a blitz game as white. I make my move, Noct is going to be giving me immediate feedback. That way I will know how I did, and I can practice my opening without having to just memorize lines. Other than repertoires, there are many useful features on Noctie, such as flashcards, which are collections of problems for you to solve, themes, which is my favorite feature by far. You can import any position and then practice it. Whenever I make a mistake in my game, I'm going to play it out against Noctie, because Noctie is going to play like a human. He's going to try to trick you like a human. If it's losing, he's going to play well. It's not going to play engine moves. So follow the link to Noctie in the description below. Get the London system repertoire and learn it the proper way. If you do decide to use Noctie, use the code hanging pawns to get a massive 64% discount. The London system repertoire is also available on my Patreon page, so follow the link in the description if you would like to download the repertoire that way. It's $3 in my shop, and you can gain access to many other repertoires if you want to buy them individually, or you can become a member on Patreon, support the channel for just $3 a month, and gain access to all of these and much more than 500 posts, videos where I share my thoughts, tournament prep, ideas, plans, and so on. And there are going to be many more PGNs and repertoires coming up in the future, and you will have access to all of those. Now let's go back to the London instead. Okay, so we are going to start with the main line, and today this is considered to be the critical setup against the London, let's say. So d4, d5, bishop f4. I should say that our repertoire is based on 2 bishop f4. If you don't know the differences between 2 bishop f4 and knight f3, you can watch my introductory video on the London. You can also find it in the description below. And today I'm not going to go into too much detail. Let me just say that bishop f4 has upsides and downsides compared to knight f3. You avoid some lines, you avoid other lines. Namely, by moving your bishop out and playing e3 quickly, you weaken the b2 pawn. Therefore, black has some ideas of playing a very early queen b6 to put pressure on that pawn. We're going to have a look at those lines. But our repertoire is based on bishop f4. And the main line goes as follows. Black plays c5 and knight c6, and then closes down the structure before moving the bishop out to f5 or g4. So we are going to look at bishop f5 setups separately and bishop g4 setup separately. But in the main line, black chooses to keep that bishop on c8. Now the upside of keeping the bishop on c8 is again that black doesn't weaken b7, doesn't allow us to play lines with queen b3. And also, because the bishop is on c8, we get to play bishop d3 and challenge the critical diagonal, let's say. So knight f3, bishop d6. White retreats this bishop. You don't want to trade, and you're never afraid of black taking on g3. Now, I haven't covered the lines with bishop takes g3 in great detail, but let me just say that they are very comfortable. For example, if black castles, black already has an issue because we have this e5 square to launch an attack from, and after, let's say, b6, knight e5, If this is taken, black immediately loses the pawn on h7 in the game. So it's not that easy to play for black if this bishop is exchanged on g3, especially if black is planning to castle. So black castles, we play bishop d3. And it's at this point that the main line starts. There are three main moves here, although there are very rare sidelines such as h6, which make very little sense, but still. The three main moves are b6, queen e7, and rook e8. Now let's start with b6. This is the line that I have played in several tournament games, and I have played it three different ways actually. But I'm going to recommend the most aggressive line, which is the immediate e4. And people will seldom know how to play against this, and usually people are going to take on e4, which is a big mistake. And in many cases, white will have a very easy win after d takes e4. So let me show you the main line first. Bishop e7. I have played this against the Croatian women's champion Ena Cvitan, and I had a plus 4.8 position, and I offered the draw, which is something I'm ashamed of, but I didn't know that I was winning. I didn't understand anything, and I was stressed. You can find that game in the Road to GM series. So basically the idea behind bishop e7 is, you know, black doesn't want to lose a piece, and black allows e5. So we play e5, and the knight comes out to h5, attacking the bishop. Now, we play tactically, we play knight g5, offering a trade of knights, because our queen is on h7. Now, black really doesn't have an alternative to taking the knight on g5. If black takes on g3, this is game over straight away, because we take on h7 first, king h8 is the only move, and now we play knight f7 check. Again, you can play king h7, but then hg3 leads to very quick mate. And you also win the queen. Or on, excuse me, rook takes f7, we now play hg3, and black is busted. Black can resign. I don't know what the best move is, but let's just put something on the board. Let's say queen f8, bishop g6. If you move the g-pawn, then bishop g6. Basically, it's mate. So on knight g5, black must take this knight, and we, of course, take back. Now, mate is hanging, so g6 is forced. Of course, h6 does not work. If black plays the move h6, then we can play knight f3. The bishop must move away, and if it does, let's say to e7, then we play bishop f4 and take on h6. So on queen takes h5, g6, our queen drops back to e2, and now black has his counterplay, takes on d4. You can see that the d-pawn is hanging, but we don't care. h4, chasing the bishop back, and h5. And the idea behind this setup, if black knows exactly what they are doing, is that white gets this massive attack on black's king side. Black has counterplay in the center. However, look at white's pieces. And if you turn on the engine, it's going to say plus 0.2, so it's technically it's equal, but black is risking a lot more. And I had this position against Ena Cvitan, who was 2250 at the time, and I got a winning position very quickly. By move 25, it was plus 4, more than plus 4. So it's very difficult to play for black. Now let me show you the sideline that you will likely face in all of your games. When I play this online, and even though I quit playing the London in tournament games, I still play it online, 90% of people take on e4. I don't remember facing bishop e7. So when they take on e4, this is the point. We exchange, the knight's hanging. So the knight must be defended. If it moves, we take the rook. So bishop b7 is the only reasonable move. And now we put more pressure on the knight. dc5 attacks the bishop, okay? And, you know, the bishop must take back. If you take back with the pawn, then I just win your bishop. So bishop takes c5. And now queen a4. The knight's attacked. Now what do? Let me just give you an example of a very simple blunder. If you play queen c8 to defend, then we have the trick that always works. Bishop takes h7. And the idea is, since the queen moved, it undefended the h4 square, so we have queen h4 check and knight g5, which is going to lead to mate. So king h7, queen h4 check. If king g6, that's mate. Just, you know, here, queen h5, king g8, and knight g5. You can delay it, but it's mate in 8 with precise play. If king g8, that's slightly better, but it's not really that much better. The rook moves, queen h7, king f8, castles queenside. The king is completely cut off. We can win this pawn at our leisure. The bishop's coming to h4, the other rook's coming to e1, and black can resign. This is +7 according to the engine. So on queen a4, the knight must be defended by the rook. If the knight should move to a5, and this is a pretty reasonable line, we can throw in rook d1. And now, when the queen comes to c8, we don't have the same pattern. If we take on h7 now, it simply doesn't work because of king h7, queen h4 check, king g8, knight g5, and rook d8. This rook is now hanging with check, or hanging. It can be traded with check, so we have to throw in a move for castles. And once we castle, rook d1, and queen c6 puts enough pressure on us so that we don't have time to checkmate black. And this is a tactical way to get out of this. So, you know, black may not know it, black may mess up, but let me just say that on knight a5, rook d1, the queen moves to c8, you don't play bishop h7. So on rook d1 and queen c8, we don't take on h7, we simply play bishop d3. And after bishop d3, we're threatening to come into h4 again. So let's say, I don't really know what to suggest. If I'm black, I'm playing f5. And f5 is, of course, a weakness, giving away the e5 square. And it's not a good move, and white should be better. So knight a5 does not work. So on queen a4, the only move is rook c8. And now what we do is we play rook d1. And remember, if the queen moves away from h4, we win. So if the queen goes to, firstly, queen c7 loses the queen. Queen e8 loses to bishop h7. It works. Okay, the rook isn't hanging, and you have this stuff going on. So king h8 is the best move. If king h7, then queen h4 check. King g8, knight g5, and resigns. The rook cannot move. It's over. It's just mate in 2. So on queen a4, rook c8, rook d1, there is only one move for black, and that's queen e7. The queen has to mind the h4 square. And white has a plus 0.6 advantage, but in practical play, I believe white has a greater advantage because our bishops are great. We have a 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side, and I think better attacking prospects. So after something like rook fd8, we can play b4. We don't have to, we can play rook fe1 as well. Let's just say, you know, something like this happens. Rook d8, black is trying to exchange everything. b4, I don't know, b5 is probably the best move. You cannot move the bishop back. If you move the bishop back to d6, then bishop takes c6, loses. So black cannot really easily move the rook away from c8. And long story short, white has a more comfortable position in most cases. So the move b6 isn't challenging. We are going to go e4, and we are going to have a great attacking position regardless of what black does. Now, my favorite move, queen e7. If you remember my first ever London system game, it was in this variation. And there is a famous trap that happens here that has only been discovered about 5 or 6 years ago in a game between Kamsky and Shankland. And the engines don't really appreciate it just yet. Still, they don't. So we go knight e5. I should say that black's idea is to, of course, play e5. And we have to keep preventing that. So we are fighting for the e5 square. Basically, by playing knight e5, we are preventing knight takes because that loses a piece, and bishop takes loses the bishop and misplaces the knight. So what the majority of people are going to do, even though it's not good, they're going to go knight d7. Now, we are going to take that knight. If queen takes d7, this leads to a forced draw. I'm going to explain how and why, but I first want to show you the more sensible bishop d7, after which black is losing. So, we have a forcing line, again, with this pressure on h7. And if you want a detailed explanation of this, a more detailed explanation, I made a separate video on traps in the London system. You can find it below, and this is explained in great depth. But we take again, and the point is that we want to draw the queen out to the 5th rank. Why? Bishop h7, okay, of course the king has to take. Queen h5 check, the king must go to g8. And now why is the queen on c5? Because of knight e4. And now we have a double attack. It's an attack on the queen and on the g5 square threatening mate. So basically black is losing. In the only game I ever had in this position, my first ever London game, my opponent played g6 and was just losing because of takes, takes, and takes. And obviously I got my material back and I'm completely winning. I don't know what to suggest for black. I think my opponent chased the knight away, something like this, and then I played knight f6, took another pawn and won the game. So after queen h5 check, king g8, knight e4, let's say the queen moves. This is the most common move. Knight g5. Black has only one way to avoid mate. You have to move the rook. So let's say rook f8. Queen takes f7, king h8 only move, queen h5, king g8, and now rook d1. The idea behind rook d1 is if this knight moves, we're going to go rook d4. And I don't know what to suggest for black. Black is busted, but we can go h4, threatening rook h3 and rook f3. And I don't know, if the knight moves, queen f7, the king moves, rook d4, and now we are going to play rook f4, the knight's going to block, we're going to go g4 and win the game. So after the move queen e7, knight e5, what black should do, instead of knight d7, which is the most sensible move, even though it loses, black should go queen c7, simply threatening to take. And after queen c7, we now take on c6, queen takes c6, and we just have a normal game where black is still fighting for e5. Now, if I had this position with black, and I'm not gonna because I play different things against the London, I would play the third option, rook e8. Now rook e8, once again, prepares e5. So once again, we play knight e5, preventing e5. And black has a couple of ways to play this, but by far the most popular is to take the knight. And we take with the pawn, the knight comes to d7, and you have a choice. Knight f3, defending the pawn, or f4, defending the pawn. Knight f3 is safer, but I recommend f4. Now, why is this a problem? It seems like we're just, keeping our pawn, and we have great attacking prospects with queen h5. It's not that simple. The only source of counterplay for black is c4. We move the bishop, and queen b6, a double attack on b2 and e3. White has not blundered. White is better. We are going to lose the pawn and be happy about it. Castles, queen e3 check, king h1, and now the queen should go back because, we will threaten to trap the queen. So after queen b6, we just go b3, saving the b pawn and looking forward to playing f5 in the future. We also have the d4 square for the knight. We have queen h5. And black's king is in trouble, and the one point that's strategically significant in all of these lines, black is yet to develop these two pieces. In particular, the bishop on c8, especially in queen b6 lines, has a very hard time moving. And technically, white is up a piece because this bishop is so inactive. So even though this seems risky, and it is because you've given up a pawn, you more than compensate for the pawn with attacking pressure. Okay, so these are the main lines. Now we are going to continue with covering c5 and queen b6. That's what most people play. So d4, knight f6, or d4, d5, knight f6, we are going to look at both. So d5, let's say, bishop f4, and c5. So this can lead to two different types of setups. The one I call the improved Caro-Kann happens after black exchanges on d4 and transposes to the exchange Caro-Kann. We are going to look at that in the separate chapter on this. But for now, let's just focus on early queen b6. Now, early queen b6 is always answered with knight c3. If the knight is not on f6 and there is a pawn on d5, black simply cannot take the pawn on b2, and it's very clear why. If you play queen takes b2, then knight takes d5, and that's just it. I don't know what to suggest other than for black to resign. If you play knight a6, I take it. If you try to defend the c7 square with the king, then simply rook b1. And after rook b1, queen a3, bishop c7 check. I don't know, king d7, rook b3, queen a2, and maybe bishop b5 check. You can see that black is in grave danger. So the pawn is not going to be taken. So after knight c3, black usually plays e6, and we're not playing the standard London, but that's fine. We can continue knight b5 here, knight a6 is the only move, and now c3, and the game goes on. This is a standard way to free up our c-pawn in queen b6 positions. We go knight b5 and then reroute the knight. You can either do that with a4, knight a3, or just knight a3. So the lines without knight f6 aren't challenging. Now, the challenging lines begin with knight f6. So bishop f4, c5. And this is the main reason I quit the London system. This is the setup I fear the most. e3, excuse me, queen b6. The pawn is attacked. Once again, we go knight c3. And now black has a choice. d6, a6, preparing to take, and I'm going to explain why, or taking the pawn straight away. Now, taking a pawn straight away is an immediate invitation to a draw. So after knight b5, knight d5, we have the option to simply play rook b1, and rook a1, and rook b1, and rook a1, and the draw. We are not going to draw. Instead, we go into something incredibly risky. Now, I learned or studied the following sequence for both colors for hours. I still don't understand it. So once you download the repertoire, please pay great attention to the following line. So as I said, if you go rook b1, black's going to take on a2 and you are going to have to repeat. It's just going to be a draw. The only alternative to the draw is playing a3. Now a3 traps the queen. And this is white playing for a win but risking a defeat. So why does this threaten to trap the queen? Well, let's have a look at, I don't know, a random move, a6. We just go rook b1, the only move is queen a2, and now we go queen c1, and that's it. Our next move is rook a1 or rook b2, winning the queen. The queen has no squares. So after a3, black is losing the queen. The queen has no squares, but black can take the rook and the knight in exchange for the queen. So they go a6, we go rook b1, they save the queen for a move, queen c1, and now that's it. You just, the queen is lost once again. Rook b2 is coming. So they take the knight, we go rook a1, they take the rook, we take back. So technically we are up material, or actually technically it's equal rook, knight, pawn for a queen, but black has a ton of counterplay. And it begins with the move e5. So if you want something against the London, play this. That being said, not many people will be brave enough to play a3 or even know that a3 is a move. So why is this so tricky? Well, the bishop is attacked, this bishop is wide open, and black combines this idea with pressure on the bishop. So we have to take the pawn. I mean, there's no alternative. Take, and now c4. And you can see that this pawn is about to fall, that black is about to have a passed pawn down the b file and a lot of counterplay. So we move the queen in anticipation of rook a3. Queen d4. Now knight f4, since the knight's hanging, makes a lot of sense. Queen f4 is what I would recommend, and now bishop takes a3. What I'm about to show you is my preferred way to try and survive this position. I have never had it in a tournament game. I have never had it in a training game. No one knows this position up to this point, but still, one day someone will. So what I'm going to do is g3. Now, of course, black has many moves, but I don't know, let's say bishop b4, threatening to come in here. King e2, rook a2, attacking the pawn, and we run away with king f3. Rook takes c2, bishop h3, knight c6. I don't know, probably bishop f5 attacking the rook is good enough. Rook d2 and king g2. And white stands a chance. If you turn on the engine, it says 0, but that's absurd because no one knows who's better here. You would have to think about this position for ages just to try and understand it. But yeah, this is how I would approach the position. And once again, after knight d5, if you're playing a grandmaster, then by all means go rook b1 and accept the draw after 5 minutes. But if you have to win, play a3. Okay, the third most common type of setup for black is bishop f5. Either now or in a few moves, black plays bishop f5, aiming to shut down the pawn structure and play a reverse London system without having a bishop on c8, of course. So the critical line that I'm going to show you first begins with knight f6, f3, c5. We've been through this. So after knight c6, knight d2, the main line was e6. The main sideline is bishop f5. Today, perhaps this could be considered the main line. I don't think it is yet, but still. Now after bishop f5, something interesting is happening. Black has claimed this diagonal, and that's very important. In conjunction with our b2 pawn, we could be in trouble. And we play knight gf3, they play queen b6, and if we go queen b3, which we are not going to do, they go c4, and we have to trade queens. If we go queen c2, we lose the queen. If we go queen d1, we lose the b2 pawn. If we go queen a4, we lose the b2 pawn. If we go queen a3, we lose the bishop to e5 because there's a discovered attack. So we have to trade. And now the thing is, this is going to be devastating. This is a very typical London system, and you can see it in other openings as well, undermining process, a minority attack that simply exploits the fact that the rook is hanging on a1, so white never has a3. So after something like bishop e2, b5, you don't play a3 because there's no point, because on b4, everything's hanging, and white's losing. So we are not gonna go into these lines. Let me just delete queen b3 from the repertoire. So after queen b6, we're going to play Sedlak's recommendation. Now, if you want a recommendation on a book on the London system, recently Milos Perunovic published the modernized London system. There's the agile London system, and there is Sedlak's original, I don't know what the name of the book actually is, London system something. They are not good. I don't want to be brutal or anything, but I don't think either of those books is enough to make you play the London system well. That being said, there are many interesting lines that you can adopt from the books. If you want to play the London seriously, I would recommend getting all 3 books. So Sedlak recommends knight h4 here. And I like the move knight h4 because, you know, the bishop's attacked. And the idea behind knight h4 is, of course, if you take on b2, we take the bishop. If you move the bishop away from this diagonal, then we can claim the diagonal and play queen b3, and if c4, queen c2. And, of course, if the bishop drops to g6, we can take it. So there are a couple of ways to play. The main move is bishop d7, after which we just go queen b3. And the same line I've shown you previously now doesn't work because we have queen c2. It's as simple as that. So after something like knight h5, we drop the bishop back. And of course, white can, you know, black can chase the knight away, but it's all fine. On the other hand, the more tricky approach is bishop e4, keeping the bishop on the diagonal. And what I recommend is playing queen b3, and after c4, exchanging and taking on e4. Now, If this is taken with the knight, which I don't think many people will do, our knight is safe and it has a good square and not much is going on. So something like, I don't know, f3, we can chase this knight, and then we can go e4, or even bishop g5, trying to chase the knight away further. And on something like h6, we exchange, of course, and we can go g4, creating another square for the knight. So that's not really problematic. So I think this move is way scarier because it takes away the square from our knight, but it's fine. We can take on c4. And if black tries to trap our pieces, then of course we can play the move knight f5, and the knight comes back to g3. None of this works. If e6, then knight g3, or even knight d6 check is good enough. And it's very easy for black to go wrong. So on knight h4, I think, you know, bishop e4 is a bad move. I really do think so. So after bishop d7, play queen b3, and you're safe. Now, let's look at a very early bishop f5. Again, I have covered this setup in a separate video on just bishop f5 setups in much greater detail. You can find it in the description. This will just be a brief explanation of the line. So when they play bishop f5 straight away, we go e3, and if they try to copy us, this doesn't work because of the same pattern we were forced to avoid with knight f3, knight h4. Instead of c3, we play c4, and the idea is we want to play queen b3, and if they defend with queen b6, we want to go c5 and provoke this capture because the queen doesn't have c7. Same thing, just in reverse. So black has an annoying way to play against this, which is exchange the knight and misplace our king with bishop b4. And against this, and again, I have faced this in a tournament game and I won the game, I don't recommend the recapture of the bishop straight away. I recommend the move queen a4. And after queen a4, black's best move is knight c6. Now we take on b1. And the reason knight c6 is the best move is because black wants to play the move bishop b4 check to misplace our king anyway. But now we have blocked their c-pawn and there's counterplay against c7. In short, that's the strategic justification behind queen a4. So on bishop b4, we move the king, something like this happens, and our center is safe. That's the main thing. Our center is safe, and of course we have the bishop pair. Now, if they do not go bishop to b1, let's say they play a normal position with, you know, c6. This is the critical thing we are trying to punish. We now go queen b3. And there are two ways to defend. One of them is queen c8. The other one is queen b6. They are both bad. Queen c8 is bad because it doesn't allow black to go bishop d6. So the bishop is condemned to a bad diagonal on e7. And queen b6 is something I see when I play Bullet online. This happens one in every 3 or 4 London system games. And people on my level in Bullet 22, 2300 fall for this all the time. We go c5. And of course, the queen cannot drop back. If queen c8, we take the pawn. If queen c7, we take the queen. It's the same position, just in reverse. So takes, takes. And now we're threatening, firstly, to take the knight and take the pawn. Secondly, to play b4, b5. So knight d7 is the only move. b4. And now if black isn't careful, let's say, you know, bishop e7, we just go b5. And that's about it. You cannot prevent me from taking. Now I'll show you how I managed to win a bunch of games. Let's say castles, takes, takes, and bishop a6. And the threat is very, very simple. Bishop b7, forking the pawn and the rook, and then also taking on a7. So this simply doesn't work. And after b4, black needs to play energetically, you know, straight away. Play something like knight h5, challenging the bishop. Not that this works, but it's the best way to play. We go bishop c7, and on rook c8, when they undefend this pawn, we now go bishop e5. If this bishop is taken, we exchange, and what does black do? If they try to save the pawn, let's say, you know, a6, then we go bishop e2. The knight doesn't have any squares, and we're also threatening g4. So black loses a piece by force. Therefore, this bishop cannot be taken. So they should play a6. And now you have this very, very famous idea of bringing the knight to a5 and forever putting pressure on b7. And if you've seen the recaps from my last tournament, you will know that that's how I lost a game with black. Not in the London system, but still. So bishop f5 isn't really good if you play c4 against it. Now, another type of position which is more common than the one I just showed you is bishop f5 in this position. And again, we go c4, they go c6, we go knight c3, they go e6, and once again, same thing, queen b3. And personally, other than being forced out of the London system by playing c4 instead of c3, that's the only thing I mind. Conceptually, these are my favorite lines to play as white in the London. Now, bishop g4 lines, and we are going to cover this very, very briefly. So if instead of bishop f5, they go bishop g4, it depends on when they do this. Have we played knight f3 or not? If they play it without us having a knight on f3, we go f3. And black's best move by far is bishop d7. And from here, black is going to have to play e6 at some point. And then white has the bishop moved. We're going to have an easier time playing e4 because of f3. I had one tournament game in this setup, and my opponent played bishop f5. That's not good. c4, g4, bishop g6, and the game went like this. And now you will see that there's pressure on d5, there's pressure on b7, so I played c4. And my opponent was losing very, very quickly. I believe my opponent played, I don't even remember what he played. I don't know. But in any case, this is problematic for white because there are going to be two pawns hanging. So let's say bishop h5, it leads to the same thing. So h4, h5, g5, knight d7, c4, let's say e6 because that makes sense, cd, ed, and queen b3 is a double attack. And after queen b3, black can play the move knight b6, but that's very awkward. So at least if black doesn't lose material, they're going to be forced in an awkward position with a knight on b6 where we can undermine with a4, a5. So I really don't think these lines with bishop g4 so early are tricky. So just, play f3. And the more common way to reach a position with bishop g4 is in lines where knight c6 and knight d2 have been thrown in. If that happens, I would recommend that you, since black has already developed everything and is ready to defend b7 and d5, I would just recommend knight f3 here. And after e6, now queen b3, and we are fine. After queen c8, which is likely the best move, we can now go h3, chase the bishop away, and just play a normal position. Hopefully you don't blunder bishop d3, watch out for that. Other than that, it's just a safe, normal game. I should say that against the London, black is never worse. If you want to be better out of the opening, do not play the London. If black knows what they're doing, they're going to be equal and slightly better in many, many lines. And that's the case here. This is, 0. Now, one of the main reasons I quit the London system is what I call the boring line. So remember the main lines where after c5, c3, black plays knight c6 and e6? The boring line begins with e6, black does not play knight c6. Instead, they go bishop d6. And when we play bishop g3, they go queen c7, fighting for e5 before we have time to play knight f3 and block. So now, when we play knight f3, they go knight bd7, and we simply don't have time for knight e5 because it loses a pawn. So we are forced into this castles. And now you can either castle and allow bishop takes d6 and e5, bishop takes g3 and e5, or you can exchange and then black is going to play e5 anyway. Basically, when that happens, black is equal. d5, knight e5, knight e5, queen e5, knight f3, queen e7. And there are several ways to play this position. I have had it with both colors. I hate it for both sides. It's equal and boring, and no one should be able to win because there are no weaknesses. However, I had it twice in tournament games and I won both games. I shouldn't have won, they were equal, but I played my opponents. But that just goes to show that even, I think my opponents were 18, 1900. Even, you know, on lower levels, my level, not grandmaster level or anything, this is sufficient to get an equal position. So if you're trying to win, you're risking going into this. And there is no way to avoid it. The best you can do is try to win from here. So what I do is I go h3, preventing bishop g4. Bishop f5 has already been prevented. So black has two main ideas, bishop d7, c6, or b6, bishop b7. Against both, we are going to play a4 and try and undermine that structure. Now, this isn't theory anymore, this is just middle game strategy, but what I like to do is go a4 and c4. And I try to put pressure on the center, and I try to get my rooks to c1 and d1, my queen to e2, and I try to exploit these weaknesses. That's what I try to do. So this is the boring line. I hate it, but there's nothing I could have done about it when I played the London system. Now I'm about to show you what I play as black against the London. Excuse me. This is what I call the improved Caro-Kann. So after d4, I go d5, and when they go bishop f4, I go c5. And after e3, I exchange. Now, why is this the improved Caro-Kann? This is the exchange Caro-Kann pawn structure. Knight c6, c3, the exchange Caro-Kann. This is the normal Carlsbad structure, but what's the difference? Let me just briefly show you the main line exchange Caro-Kann, the way you enter it from the Caro-Kann. Takes, takes, bishop d3, knight c6, c3, knight f6, bishop f4. Notice how it's the same structure, and notice how white is controlling this diagonal and this diagonal. Now let's go back to this position when reached from the London system of order. d4, d5, bishop f4, c5, e3 takes, takes, knight c6, bishop d3 cannot be played because of knight takes d4, so c3 first, and now bishop f5. In this case, white's controlling the h to b8 diagonal, but black's the one controlling the b1 h7 diagonal. That's a huge improvement. The reason the exchange Caro-Kann is, and by the way, I play that as white against the Caro-Kann, the reason why it's good for white is because white has superior bishops. In this case, you don't. So instead of going into the London, you just have an improved exchange Caro-Kann. So, you know, white goes knight d2, we go e6, white goes, I don't know, knight f3, we go bishop d6, challenging this bishop, and black has absolutely no trouble. So this is what I would recommend as white against this, even though it's perfectly equal. You exchange, and you go knight h4. This is the only compensation we can get. Black has claimed the diagonal, but by playing knight d2 and knight f3, we get to play knight h4 very quickly. The bishop must move to g6, there are no alternatives, and now we take it. And after knight f3, defending h2, knight e7, g3. This is what I do with black. I go f6 and king f7. That's what I do. There are many ways to play, but I prefer that. And as white, I prefer a kingside fianchetto. Now it's equal. That's why I play it as black. And there are no problems for black. Still, I believe this is the best you can do as white against the Caro-Kann in the London. Now we are moving into very broad territory of setups with d6, g6, or d5, g6. I have divided them into two chapters. One I call the Grunfeld, the other I call the King's Indian / Reti. The Grunfeld being the one with d5, g6, the King's Indian being one with d6, g6. The main thing we have to know, and again, showing you all the theory would be incredibly challenging and impossible. What I like to do against this is I like to employ the safe method of waiting for black to commit. There are many ways for black to play. They can play with c5 or without c5. They can play with b6. They can play with knight d7. They can play with knight c6. They can play with a6, b5. They can play with e6. They can play with g6. There are a million things they can do. So I wait for them to commit. If they play g6, let's say a normal Grunfeld, I don't do anything committing. Bishop g7, h3. I'm just preventing knight h5 and creating a square for the bishop castles. Bishop e2. Now, in g6 setups, I always play bishop e2 because having a bishop on d3 doesn't really work because there's this pawn chain, and also it's playing against knight h5 and it's preparing h4, h5. Not that we are going to do that, but that's a possibility. So let's say c5, c3, and knight c6 castles. This is very, very standard. So what black is going to try to do from here, what black has to try to do is play for e5. And if they aren't careful, if they make, a random move, like a6, let's say, then we can play knight e5. And notice how our bishop is here, so they don't have knight h5. We are preparing to prevent e5 by force. And this, even though it's equal, isn't easy to play for black. So what black should do in these Grunfeld setups, again, conceptually, they can do it via several different move orders, is they need to go knight d7. And after knight d7, they need to start preparing e5. So knight bd2, e5. And once again, if you remember the boring line, we reach the same type of position where black has played e5. And unfortunately, we have this typical Caro-Kann structure where, let's say, we are the ones playing the Caro-Kann structure as white, where there's a weakness on e4, there's a weakness arguably on d5, and neither side really has much to play for. So worst case scenario for you, you're going to get this position in which, black is equal, black has played e5. However, in my experience, many people who play this are not going to be playing for e5, and you're just going to be better. Now, the second critical type of position is Reti / King's Indian. So after d4, knight f6, bishop f4, g6, e3, they go bishop g7, and then they go d6. Now, again, this is covered in a separate video. I have linked all the variations in depth below, and you should watch those videos. But it's important to remember that even though this is a King's Indian for black, black can play this two different ways, well, three different ways. The first way, the first difference we need to appreciate is whether they go for c5 or e5. If they play neither move, well then, they likely don't have any idea what they're doing, so black should play for one of these. And then the third option is to throw in b6 with either move. If they play b6, we are likely going into Reti territory. If they play e5, we're likely going into the King's Indian. What I like to do here is h3. Once again, non-committal, saving the bishop, waiting for black to commit. Black castles, bishop e2. We don't want the bishop on d3. The reason we don't want the bishop on d3, other than, the fact that it's staring at this wall of pawns, is because when e5 happens, if we haven't moved the bishop yet, we don't want to run into e4, forking bishop and knight. So it's just safer. Now let's have a look at two options. The first option is c5. Reti territory, or Dragon Sicilian if you want to call it that way, or the Benoni, it doesn't matter. c3. Now, they can play b6, they don't have to play b6. If they go queen b6, we are ready to play queen b3, so that's not challenging. They can also go knight d7 or knight c6. But b6 is the critical move, and this is basically the Reti in reverse. And if you've seen any of my games as black against the Reti, this is what I do as black as well. I just play the reverse London. So this is a well-known position. So we castle, they go bishop b7, knight bd2, knight bd7, and a4. This is the clear best path forward, and this is what I do with white and black. Black really needs to play a6 here to prevent an expansion. and then we retreat the bishop in anticipation of an eventual e5. I should say that e5 straight away is not a good idea. If they play rook e8, for example, and we, I don't know, let's find a move. Let's just play a stupid move that doesn't do anything. If they go e5, we have knight c4, and I have won many tournament games with the same pattern with both colors. And of course, after e4, the d pawn and the d6 square are still weak, so after knight d2 they have to deal with this, and the only way they can do that is actually to play d5, and now after knight d6 it's game over. So, you know, black cannot go e5 easily. Queen b3, bishop c6 is just one of the ways for black to play. They want to put pressure on b2, and usually against this setup I move my rook and play either knight e1 or bishop f1. I prefer bishop f1. And what we're going to do is we're going to play for b4 and try and expand on the queen side. So something like this should be relatively equal. Once again, if you play this, it's bound to be equal if black knows what they're doing. Now, if they stick to the proper King's Indian, they will likely go knight d7. And we castle, and then they are going to go queen e8 or rook e8. This is the King's Indian attack in reverse, basically, or the King's Indian defense. We move the bishop in anticipation of e5, and e5 happens. We go c3. One very important thing about these King's Indian positions is when they have played e5, be careful about playing knight bd2. We are not afraid of e4 unless we are forced to play knight e1. So what I like to do here is I like to play a4 and knight a3 and delay knight d2. If they do go e4, well, this is really not a big deal, because now, you know, our knight is safe, this pawn is weak, we can eventually start undermining with f3, and what black has to do is move the knight somewhere, very likely to h7 and play f5 and continue with the normal King's Indian attack ideas. But white has a bunch of counterplay on the queen side, and especially against d6, so when we start undermining this, black's going to be in trouble. This is much, much better for white. And after something like h5, we just go c4 and plow one, b6, knight c3. Obviously, we have a very, very good position with no weaknesses. The engine gives this as actually winning for white. But what I wanted to say is, do not commit to playing knight d2. If you go knight d2, the same thing is very risky because of e4. Okay, now let's move on to the Dutch. Against the Dutch, we have to factor in three different setups, basically. After f5, we always go bishop f4. And let's have a look at the Leningrad first. This is what I enjoy the most, or we can also reach the Leningrad via this move order, it doesn't matter, g6. We go h4. Now, we have this pressure on h5, we have this bishop, and h4 is a very dangerous move. The only way for black to stay in the game is to play h6. If they, let's say, play bishop g7, then black is very close to losing. h5, this is an exchange sacrifice, but it wins the game if taken. And if not, if black doesn't do anything here, we just go h6. And if, you know, d6, h6, bishop f8, this is +1. It's just busted, because there is so much control on the king side, the knight's coming to g5, that black can hardly survive this. And of course, if they take this, then it's even worse. Queen h5 check, king f8 only move, queen takes f5, king g8, and now we just continue. Knight c3, castles queen side. The queen's coming back to h3. It's just going to be losing for black. The fact that we have given up an exchange is not important at all. We have so much piece activity, and black's king is so unsafe that long-term black cannot survive. So against h4, black should play h6. And what we're going to do is very aggressive. We are going to play queen f3 and put pressure on the g-pawn. So after bishop g7, we go queen g3, forcing king f7, and now we castle queenside. And from here on, we are going to go knight h3, bishop c4, rook e1, and then f3 e4 or f3 g4, and just break open the center. Personally, I love playing against Leningrad setups when I have the London. Another way for black to play is to play the stone wall. And if they do this, we are going to play c4 and just reach a normal stone wall where we are preventing bishop d6. So if you know the normal way in the main lines to play against the stone wall, one of the main ideas is to play b3 and bishop a3 and exchange this bishop on f8. Why? Because strategically black is in a lot of danger if they are left with this poor stone wall bishop on c8. So white profits from every other trade. Technically, if we traded every piece off, especially the dark squared bishop, black would be left with a terrible bishop on c8. Now, okay, there are ways to get that bishop out. You can do stuff like this, and it's not always bound for misery until the end of the game. But having a bishop on f4 is very beneficial. And if you know the horsefly defense in the bird, or if you know one of the main lines in the stone wall is white goes knight h3 and bishop f4 to challenge the bishop that comes out to d6. So playing the stone wall against the London move order is just absurd, because after knight c3, when you inevitably play, bishop d6, I'll just take it. And you have just traded off your main attacking piece other than the knight on e4. So I don't really think there's any theory you have to know here. Just, exchange the bishop and that's it. And if they go bishop e7, well, then there's no attack coming. Why is black playing the stone wall without the attacking possibilities? So let's have a look at the last setup, the classical Dutch. So we go knight f3, they go, b6 or d6. Usually against the London, people are going to go b6 to exploit the fact that we don't have a bishop on g2. So bishop e2, bishop b7, castles. They can go bishop d6 or bishop e7. Personally, as black, when I play the classical Dutch against the London, I go bishop d6, and I invite this trade because, and as white, I think we should take. Let me explain why. The reason black likes this is because black is controlling e5. And the reason white likes this is because we can now go c4, and black really should go d5. If they castle, we are going to slowly prepare d5 ourselves. So at some point, black needs to play d5, and black's going to be left with a bad structure. But most people are going to play the normal classical Dutch way with bishop e7. And again, we go c4, the castle, knight c3, and you cannot really call this the London system because we played c4, but playing c3 would make very little sense. So I would urge you to do something more aggressive like this. Knight e4, against knight e4, we are going to take it. And the reason I like taking this is because now we can go bishop g3, preventing any ideas of g5, f4. And when black does something, we're going to go knight d2. And the bishop is going to retreat. And we always have the option to challenge it with bishop f3. But more importantly, we can now, unopposed, continue our attack down the queen side. And you can see that black doesn't really have any attack yet. And white's position is fine. Now, the Dutch is one of the rare examples where white has an advantage if they play properly, because the Dutch, according to the engine, is unsound. The final setup I want to show you is the Nimzo / Queen's Indian. So what if they play e6 and b6? Well, after bishop b7, we go knight d2. We delay moving our c-pawn until they play c5. There's no need to play c3 beforehand. Bishop e7, h3, once again creating a square for the bishop. Castles, bishop d3, c5, c3, and we have now transposed to a Reti, or whatever else you want to call it, but there's no bishop on g7. So instead of having the d6, e7, g6 structure with the bishop on g7, black is playing with e6 and the bishop on e7. Now from here they can play d6 or d5. And these positions are well known, and there are There's a million ways to play this for black. So me showing you theory would make no sense because it's not really theory. I'm going to try to explain the ideas. So let's say they play d6, which is one of the most common ways to play. Firstly, we complete our setup, and we at some point play bishop h2. We don't have to do it now because black isn't threatening e5 yet. I like the move queen e2, and after queen c7, I like playing for e4. The same thing could be achieved with rook e1, but this is slightly more precise in my opinion. And at this point, we're threatening to advance with e5 because bishop f3, knight f3 still overprotects the square. So when we do this, black has to play e5, which is the reason they played d6 and queen c7 in the first place. So e5. We take, they take back, we go bishop h2. And this is very, very similar to many anti-Miran lines with colors reversed. If you have ever played the Semi-Slav, you will know this is the position I usually get, except of course this bishop is not on h2. This is the structure I usually get from the anti-Miran. And from here on, since it's a symmetrical structure, a lot is going to depend on the d-file. And as for pawn breaks, it's very hard to establish what needs to be done here. Personally, I like playing for f4 in these positions, even though it's very risky, but the alternative is not doing anything. One upside white has is this very famous structure where one side has c5 e5 or c4 e4 and the other side has c3 e4. That means that we are covering the d4 square. It's not easy to infiltrate. So for example, if black did this, they wouldn't be able to enter on d4. On the other hand, if we manage to get the knight to e3, for example, rook d1, knight f1, knight e3, we have the d5 square. And that could be a big deal. So my usual approach to these positions is strategic in nature. I want to eliminate the defenders of the d5 square, which is the reason I like queen e2. Because in some positions after, let's say, rook c8, I'm going to go bishop a6, trade off the bishop. And once I trade off the bishop, I'm one step closer to achieving my dream of planting a knight on d5, a knight that cannot be traded. So you will inevitably get a symmetrical structure if black knows what they're doing. So, you know, try to think conceptually and long-term and don't rush. And you don't necessarily have to break open the position with, you know, a5, a4, a5, or b4 or f4. You can play it slowly. Okay, so this was my London repertoire. If I still played the London in tournament games today, this is what I would do. I have not shown you all the lines. There are many more lines in the repertoire you can download. I tried to make it in a much greater detail than the Sicilian and the Caro-Kann repertoires. So hopefully it's useful. Let me know what you think. And also let me know if you have some lines you prefer over the ones I've shown. Thank you for watching. Hope you got something from the video. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.